Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. For those who don't know me, I'm Marianne Peters, and I'm the provost of the Naval War College. On behalf of the president of the Naval War College, Rear Admiral John Christensen, and Captain Douglas Mkhitaryan, the commanding officer of Naval Station Newport, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Naval Station Newport's observance of African American Black History Month. I'd like to acknowledge Captain Mkhitaryan, Captain, and our special guests, the 7th and 8th graders from St. Michael's Country Day School. February was designated Black History Month by President Gerald Ford in 1976. But well before that, in 1926, Harvard historian Dr. Carter Woodson and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History established Negro History Week. So there has long been recognition of the need to study and reflect on the rich history of generations of African Americans and their struggle against slavery, oppression, and adversity. This month, we should also take time to learn more about the many important contributions African Americans have made to this country, contributions in all fields of endeavor, in the sciences and the arts, in politics and philanthropy, in business and in government, and not least, of course, in our armed forces. More than 123,000 active duty, reserve, and civilian members of the United States Navy identify themselves as African Americans. This Navy total force includes 22 active and reserve flag officers, 559 active and reserve Master Chief Petty officers who identify themselves as African Americans. And of course, African Americans serve proudly and with distinction in all the branches of our armed services. But while celebrating the contributions of African Americans, we can never forget that it was the slave trade that brought Africans to America in chains. Colonial Newport was a hub of this terrible trade, and it made this town quite prosperous in the 18th century. Our guest speaker today is Keith Stokes, who is the executive director of the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation. Prior to his appointment to the Economic Development Corporation, Mr. Stokes was the executive director of the Newport County Chamber of Commerce, a position he held for 15 years. In addition to his experience promoting business and economic development, Mr. Stokes is a frequent lecturer on historic preservation and community planning. And he is also well known for his considerable expertise on early African American and Jewish American history. Mr. Stokes has researched and studied the early slave trade and the role that Newport played in the commerce of molasses, rum, and slaves. And it is that part of our history that Mr. Stokes will be talking about today. So please join me in welcoming back Mr. Keith Stokes to the Naval War College and Naval Station Newport.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, particularly being a native Newporter. It gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about and share with you the history of my community, but from the perspective of people, particularly men, women, and families. It looked more like me and less like George and Martha Washington. And I think one of the most important aspects of this presentation that you'll hear today is the fact that this title here about Center of Slave Trade, I'm not going to talk as much about slave trade, but I'm going to talk more about the early Africans, who they were, how they arrived, and most importantly, how they persevered despite the horrendous circumstances of arriving as enslaved Africans. So today, my discussions is going to be based on three very simple elements of the chapter of these Africans. First, we're going to talk about a whole new way of really sharing and discussing and understanding and hopefully valuing the history of Africans and later African Americans in America. The second piece is going to talk about the slave trade. My grandmother, when I was very young, And she, again, was probably the greatest historian in my lives. In fact, the greatest historians in your lives will always be your parents and grandparents. But my grandmother, when I was very young, made a very important statement to me about slavery and slave trade that has carried me forward to these years ahead. She said, slavery is simply how we got here. It has nothing to do with who we are as a people. So let me say that again. Slavery is simply how we arrived in America. Who we are, our culture, our religion, our family, our language, our entrepreneurial enterprise, that's what's of value. And that's what needs to be discussed, understood, and shared. So the second part, we'll talk about how these Africans arrived, and particularly within Newport. And then the third part, which as you see behind me, is going to be a discussion from a perspective of one of the most important historic assets in the world that we have right here within our community of Newport. The oldest and certainly the largest historically intact in its authentic form enslaved African and later free African cemetery. There are over 300 markers, 305 to be exact, dating back to the 17th and 18th century of African men, women, and children that once lived, worked, played, worshiped in this community nearly 4 centuries ago. So I'll end with a perspective of who these Africans were and their great contributions from the perspective of this cemetery. And I urge you, particularly the students at St. Michael's, come out to the cemetery, see it, touch it, feel it, and more importantly, after today's lecture, you're going to be armed with a lot of historical information where you're going to have a very informed, a very enjoyable experience. Make sure I'm doing this right. Am I pointing it the right way? Got it. When we talk about the history of the Americas, or any type of history, we tend to gravitate to what we see and feel and we can touch. And when you think about the great history of our great country of America, the visual interpretation of what is American history, particularly the early founding fathers, we don't tend to step back and think in terms of anything beyond those initial images of who should be associated with being a founding father of early America. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. And the faces that you see here, the images that you see here, are very much of the images that we all tend to relate to and respond to when we talk about and we feel and we see early American history. But very few people would realize that particularly here in colonial Newport, most of the men, women, and children who also lived, worked, looked less like, as I said, George and Martha Washington, and more like this young man behind me, who's John Comino, who arrived here from what is today Ghana at the age of 9, and later would become a privateer in the Continental Navy and die in service of his country. And a little bit later, you'll learn more about who John Comino is, how he received the name Quamino, his wife and his children, and their legacy going forward within this community. So it's important when we start to talk about the history of Africans and African Americans, we have to think of it in terms of not European immigration to the Americas, but the forced immigration of Africans, forced immigration of arriving as slaves. But as they arrived here, they did not arrive here looking and talking like Denzel Washington or Keith Stokes or any of us of color today. These were men, women, and largely children who came directly from Africa. In fact, nearly all the Africans who would arrive in what is today Rhode Island came from what is today Ghana. About 90% and more of the Africans that came here came from Ghana. So when you think in terms of what an African would have looked like, what their language would have been, their culture and religion 300 years ago in Newport, think today of how men, women, and families live, work, and worship in Ghana today. So as I had said, it's important that we recognize that the Africans who arrived here under the most horrific circumstances as enslaved chattel property. And we recognize that Newport played a very important and very central role in the early arrival of these enslaved Africans. To give you a perspective, if this was about 1770, and we were in Newport at that time, all of us walking the streets, there would have been a population of about 12,000 full citizens in that town. Today we have about 25,000 people in Newport. Out of the 12,000 people in Newport in 1770, nearly a third were Africans, mostly all enslaved. So 1 out of 3 people that you would have bumped into in downtown Newport would have been from Ghana and African. And again, not looking like me and not having my Rhode Island accent, these would have been young people who had arrived here as slaves from what is today Ghana, a third of our population. In fact, if we compared Newport's slave population compared to other major cities of that time in early America, only Charleston, South Carolina had a larger percentage of slaves to population than any city in America at that time. We far exceeded Boston, New York, Savannah, Georgia, Philadelphia. It's Newport. So a third of the citizens look a lot like that John Comino. And as people talk about how these Africans arrive, it's largely in historical references referred to as the African slave trade or the triangular trade. Newport, by the mid-18th century, between what we call the Golden Age of 1705 to 1775, at the very beginnings of the American Revolution, that Golden Age, Newport is at the center of that trade. We are the third largest prosperous sailing port behind New York, Boston, and Charleston, South Carolina. So a third of the population of Newport at that time are Africans, mostly enslaved. It's a prosperous maritime port. And Newport's participation in this triangular trade, as little as you see behind me here, the voyage of the Sanderson in 1752, Newport is sending ships and products and goods to West Africa, largely along what is called the Gold Coast, Ghana, and the Grain Coast, which is, or the Rice Coast in some cases, which is Guinea. And there we would trade either rum or other products for slaves, and then those slaves would be brought from West Africa in Newport vessels to the West Indies, and there in the West Indies, most of those Africans would be sold into the plantation systems, the sugar plantation systems, coffee, tea, and others, into the West Indian plantation system. But smaller groups of Africans were highly selected to come further north and back into Rhode Island, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that triangular trade is literally that triangular trade of running from Newport to West Africa, to the West Indies, and then running up coastal America via Savannah and Charleston and Philadelphia and Baltimore, New York, and eventually back to Newport. What's important to recognize, and again, anyone who's going to be a future historian, you have to be able to connect the fact that people and places, the things that they did in history, were usually based on common sense and based on the technology and the opportunities that were before them. So when we take common sense and we think in terms of why would so many Africans that came to Rhode Island come from Ghana? Why Ghana? Well, you step back and you think in terms of, we were established here in New England as an English colony. The French certainly established French colonies and possessions in Canada, the Spanish in Florida and the western part of this country. But here, we're an English colony. And if we could take back to the 17th and 18th century, the English, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, and Portuguese, we were at war. We were all vying for power and control of this triangular trade and all the riches within that. So if you're an English colony, and Rhode Island established as an English colony, who do you think we're going to trade with? St. Michael's students. Fellow English, correct? We're not going to trade with the Spanish and the French and the Portuguese and the Dutch because we compete with them. We're at war with them. So when you think in terms of what were the largest English slave colonies in West Africa, it's Ghana and it's Sierra Leone. And in fact, when you think of the West Indies, as we're transporting these slaves from English now hold slave castles and possessions in Ghana and Sierra Leone, and we're bringing them to the West Indies, are we bringing them to Cuba, Puerto Rico, later the Dominican Republic? Are we bringing them to either Spanish or Dutch or Portuguese-held islands? No, we're bringing them to English-held islands, Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, Bahamas. And then eventually they would come up to the English colony of Rhode Island. So once you start to understand logically the trading systems, the geographic relationships, the political and social relationships, you find that logically the Africans who would arrive here would come from what is today Ghana. Once they arrived in Newport, and this becomes very important, here's what I'm going to ask you, and particularly the students. If you've been doing any reading or any analysis and study on early African slavery, stop what you've been thinking about and listen to me very carefully. The Africans that arrived here did not arrive in an antebellum 19th century agricultural-based economy, which most Africans tend to be recognized in slavery in the Americas. Meaning, if you read the book Roots or saw the miniseries Roots, it's outstanding. but it really is focused on a very limited time in history, the late 18th and early 19th century, and really a southern antebellum agricultural-based economy. How many of the students here are Rhode Islanders? How many of you were born in Rhode Island? A lot of you, right? February is pretty cold, isn't it? Pretty yucky at this time. Not a great place to be. We love Rhode Island, but it gets cold, and it's a hard place to live. How many of you at St. Michael's know the entire official name of our state? State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, the smallest state, largest name. We have never, ever in the economic history of our state have been an agricultural-based dependent economy. We've had farms, but the farms were never large production farms that would drive a Rhode Island economy because we have bad weather. This is not the Bahamas. It's not the Carolinas. You're not planting and growing and harvesting rice or tobacco or coffee or tea or cotton and all what we call the cash crops that made men and families and kingdoms wealthy at that time. We have bad weather, bad soil. If you grow up here on Aquinic Island, we sit mostly on sand and shale. So the only things that we're growing consistently is some corn and some potatoes. So even though we have plantations in our name, we don't have an agricultural plantation economy. 90% of the Africans that would come across from Old World to New World, from the continent of Africa to the Western Hemisphere, 90% would land in the Caribbean and South and Central America. And nearly all of those slaves would be working in those plantation-based economies, which at that time were the leading world economies at that time in producing the cash crops that were creating the greatest amount of wealth at that time. Tobacco and sugar at that time is like the microchip today. It was that value, and there was such a demand. And unlike the microchip, things like tobacco and sugar and coffee, very addictive. We figured that out. So the Africans that came were literally Africans that were mostly going south and in the West Indies because they were really required to be the workforce, the labor force, for those cash crops and those large plantations. The Africans that would arrive here would be very different. Since we didn't need to have large numbers of Africans working in sugar plantations in Narragansett or cotton fields in Middletown, we were not looking for strong young men. We were looking for a very different enslaved African. And I'm not here to say it's good, bad, or indifferent. You're enslaved, you're enslaved. You're owned. You have no choice. Your life is completely dominated, dictated by a master. But it's the economies in the geographic location of Rhode Island that create some very unique circumstance. Not better or worse, but unique. So one, our geography. Bad soil, bad, unpredictable weather. So we don't really need a lot of slaves to work on plantations. The second is the men and women and families that settled here in New England generally, but particularly in Rhode Island, had one virtue that separated them from anyone else in the settlement of the world, New World at that time. It separated them from the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch. It's even separated them from fellow English Protestants in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The men and women and families that arrived here were looking for something so precious and so unique that it could only be found and only be established in this colony of Rhode Island. They were looking for an opportunity to worship God freely and separately from any mandate of a king and a queen or a governor. So Roger Williams at Providence, John Clark, Ann Hutchinson, William Connington, Benedict Arnold, not the traitor, his great-great-grandfather, they would come here to this island, and together they would establish a colony, for the first time in English laws, a colony that would allow that any citizen, and citizens at that time were men, landowners over the age of 21, who were white, but it was for the first time a colony was established where there was no official religion. And most importantly, if you represented a minority religious group, or you had no religion, you could still be accepted in this colony. You would not be persecuted. You would not be required to swear an oath of allegiance to the colony and to a church. Now today we kind of say, well, that doesn't seem like a big deal. But in the 17th century, it was the only deal. So as this colony was established at Rhode Island, under what Roger Williams, our early settler, had called the liberty of conscience, men, women, and families from nearly every dissident minority religious group of the world started pouring into Rhode Island. In fact, Connecticut colony petitioned England, King Charles II court, and suggested they called us Rogues Island, not because of pirates, but because we were allowing all of these heretics, such as Quakers, Jews, all of these groups that we would never allow in Massachusetts, Connecticut colonies or New York, they're coming into Rhode Island. So what became so unique was that we became this magnet of groups of families and religious groups who were being persecuted, in some cases put to death, because they simply worship God as a Quaker or as a Jew. So very early on, the men and women and families that began to establish themselves here had a heightened sense and a heightened recognition of religious toleration and freedom. The third element that is unique is the fact that the Africans that would arrive here are children. In fact, most of the Africans who would eventually arrive in colonial Newport were under the age of 14, many as young as 6 and 7. Now think about it. If I was a young 7-year-old African in Ghana and I was captured and sold into slavery, it would take probably about 3 months to get me from West Africa, maybe stopping over in the Azorian Islands or stopping over in Cape Verde, but it would take me about 3 months to get to Barbados. And there in Barbados, it would take me another 2 months to get up to Newport. So all told, it's close to 6 months plus of traveling of a child going from West Africa, West Indies to Newport. But they did, and they survived, and they prospered. But why children? Well, it's a very important element of why children. We don't have a large plantation-based economy. We don't need slaves working in Middletown cotton fields or Newport tobacco fields because they don't exist. But what are we doing at that time? What is needed in the workforce in the marketplace? Newport becomes the very center of the artisan trades and skills. We cannot grow things, but we can take things and refit them and rebuild them and redesign them and make them into a value-added, better product. We can't grow sugar, but we can take that sugar and molasses and we can mix it and boil it and make it into something called rum. In fact, Newport by 1770 controlled about 90% of the Guinea English rum market. There were 24 rum distilleries in downtown Newport alone. So you think of Thames Street, Washington Square, Long Wharf, you think people talk about it gets very loud in the summertime, a lot of hooting and hollering and drinking. You should have been there in 1770. 24 rum distilleries. We controlled that market. So we couldn't harvest, we certainly couldn't plant or harvest sugar, but our ships could bring up rum and molasses, molasses and sugar, and distill that into rum. And we needed master barrel makers, cord winders or rope makers, carpenters, rum makers, and it was all these Africans that did this work. In fact, nearly all of the artisan trade support work in Newport at that time was done by these early Africans. So why a child? Because to be an artisan, to be an apprentice, it took 4 or 5 years to become a master barrel maker or a stonemason or a glassblower. It took time, it took education, it took guidance. So by bringing a child in, as they did in Europe, starting at the age of 8 and 7 and 9 and 10, within 4 or 5 years, because by the time you're in your teens, you're an adult, you now are a master tradesman. So here in generally New England, but particularly in Newport, we greatly valued in supporting our economy, we greatly valued Africans, young Africans, who would learn the artisan arts and trades and have access to education and language and training that would have been unheard of, but really unnecessary in the Southern and West Indian markets. You also have a unique circumstance where you think in terms of the book Roots, or the movie Roots, and you think in terms of slavery in the South, and you think in terms of the master's house, the big house on top of the hill, and then the slave quarters. And I've had scholars from all across the world over the years come to me saying, we want to see where Africans, both enslaved and free, lived in Newport. And everyone rushes around Newport to look for it. In fact, they go to the Breakers Mansion on Bellevue Avenue, and then they say, so where are the slave quarters? And I have to remind them, that's a different time, it's a different market, there is no slave quarters. In the 17th and 16th century, young African children who arrived as slaves lived in the same household as master and mistress. In fact, in many cases, they shared the same rooms and bedrooms as masters and mistresses' children. And they grew up in that environment. And as they got older, these Africans would then still live within the home, but live in areas of, if you're an old New Englander, we call them garrets, which is an attic. And they would outfit your garret or your attic as a room for your servant. Or on the first floor, what we have in my house, we call it a pantry. That pantry was also a living space and a workspace for that enslaved African. So the next time you're in downtown Newport, you go into the Point section, Washington Street, 2nd Street, look at some of the nice colonial homes, and notice they've got this like boxy little add-on on the first floor on the back or the side. That's a pantry, and that would have been where the slave had their bunk, their food, that's where they would have had their work, and that's how they would have interacted in the household. The third, so they're young children trained in the artisan trades. They're cohabitating because of the necessity of a very densely compacted urban environment. And then the third piece is, remember what I'd said, the early settlers that came here greatly valued and greatly achieved religious freedom. So as these settlers established themselves in worshiping God freely, these African children who lived in the same house, worked side by side, they just incorporated them into their religion. So if you were a Quaker and you were a slave owner, your slaves attended the Quaker meeting house with you, and they had names such as Charity and Duchess, and they'd wear the brown, and they'd follow the Quaker tradition. In Jewish households in Newport, we have 9 Africans listed as Israelites, and they have names like Rebecca and Moses and Sarah. In Trinity, my Trinity Anglican Church, they're sitting and taking part of services in the church, and they're following the Anglican faith. So you have 3 unique, not better or worse, but 3 unique circumstances that existed here that would exist like nowhere else where Africans were enslaved. Access to education and training and artisan skills, cohabitations with whites, and third, most importantly, access to religion. It would have been against the law, unlawful, unneeded to have Africans having access to education, religion, and certainly not cohabitating in the southern part of this country or the West Indies. And again, I want to preface this. This does not make New England slave owners better or worse than South. They are simply responding to the markets and the opportunities and the conditions that existed in New England as compared to the South of the West Indies. In fact, there's a very, very old African slave saying, and sometimes we hear it today as called sold down the river. And what that comes from is that Africans recognize better to be a house servant or an artisan enslaved in New England than being in a tobacco plantation in the Virginia colonies, which was still better than being further south with the snakes and the mosquitoes and the pestilence in a rice plantation in the Carolinas, which was still a heck of a lot better than being in the sugar plantations of the West Indies. So if you were a slave who ran, and many did, if you were disobedient, the threat was always to be sold south or down the river. That was the recognition of the unique, not better or worse, but the unique social economic circumstances. So that's the first part of this lecture, is to understand how these Africans arrived and the unique circumstance that they lived within. And I also want to point out that as these Africans arrived, and nearly coming all from Ghana, they began to set up their own social, economic, religious systems, unlike anywhere else of Africans. In fact, one of the things that we're very proud about being in Newport is Newport has more authentic, original colonial structures than any city in America. Now, let me say that again. Newport has more authentic, original colonial structures, buildings, wharfs, you name it, institutional buildings, than any city in America. That includes New York, Boston, Philadelphia, big cities. It's kind of hard to think with all the tens and tens of thousands of structures in those cities. It's little old Newport that has the most colonial era historic structures. We also have over 50 structures that still exist all across Newport where early Africans lived, worked, worshiped, and played, both enslaved and, more importantly, that you see behind me, just 3 examples where Africans owned their own homes. Not African Americans. This is not Keith Stokes or Denzel Washington. I love putting myself together with Denzel Washington. My wife never believes that, but I like saying that. These were Africans who actually purchased their own freedom, won their own freedom, and then applied trades, and built opportunities for themselves in this community, owning homes. And here are just some of the examples from Salma, Nubia, which is Pope Street, Nathaniel Rodman, which is 2nd Street, and then Neptune Thurston, which is over on Chestnut Street. You'll never see plaques on these homes saying that because this history has not been properly told and understood and valued. But these were their homes, well before any one of us in this room. Now, I want to really get into what I think is the fun part of this presentation, which is the cemetery. But before I do that, and particularly the students here, we're going to do a quick primer on what you should be looking for when we begin to present the markers on this cemetery. And if it really is exciting for you, I hope that you get out to go look at the cemetery and walk through it and see the names. But let's step back and talk a little bit about what I've talked about. We know now that these Africans that arrived here arrived as enslaved. We know that they largely arrived from what is today Ghana. We know that they were children. But now let's step back and talk a little bit about West African culture and religion and family systems. And particularly one of the most important pieces of West African family systems is what is called the day name. When you were born, you were given the name of your people or the name of your village or the name of your elders, but most importantly, you're given a day name. So as you can see here behind me, for boys born on Sunday, Kwazi or Kwash, Juba or Ajoba for girls born on Monday, Kofi, which is really the anglicized version of Kofi, are boys clearly born on Friday. We have several hundred Kofis in Newport alone. It's spelt with K's, C's, 2 F's, 1 E, 2 E's, all different Kofis. That simply means that what we know and what you know, that most of the boys in colonial Newport or of African descent came from Ghana, and that was what their day name was. Now, they have lots of names with it. In fact, remember, what did they do? They arrive from Africa, they get incorporated into households and social and religious, and they begin to take on the religious identity of their families. So you see these really interesting mixtures of names where you have Kwarko Honeyman, Kofi Cockroach, who's a real person, Kofi Newport, Kwash Mowat, Kwarko Malbone. You have this blending of European Anglican names with African names. But what's most important, particularly for the students here, every single one of those children maintained their day name. And as they grew up and married and had children, they passed on those day names and their cultures to those children. If this was, unfortunately, the West Indies or the South, that would have been completely wiped out. There would have been no need, it would have been unlawful, no African identity, no naming, no culture, just work on the plantation, and when you die, we replace you. Here, they maintain aspects of their culture, their language, their religion, which would have been unprecedented for Africans anywhere else who were enslaved in the New World. So what I'd like to do is now talk about the third portion of this lecture, is our cemetery. As I had said, our African cemetery, our burying ground, which later by the 1830s the African American community begins to call it God's Little Acre, is a little over an acre in the common burying ground right on Farewell Street, great name, that has about 305 existing markers. There are thousands of markers that have been lost. But 305 existing markers of 17th, 18th, and 19th century Africans and later African Americans. And I'm going to walk through each of these markers to tell you a little bit about the marker, the story of the person behind it, or as we say, kind of the stories in the stone. But most importantly, one of the things I'm going to do here in this marker, and this is in recognition of my grandmother, and I'll say for the third time, remember what she said. Slavery is just how we got here. It doesn't tell you anything about who we are as a people. So I'm going to show you these markers. We know that they arrived as slaves, but you're going to see images attached to these markers based upon the age, the sex, and most importantly, what an African from Ghana would have looked like who would have died in 1710 or 1790 in Newport. And then I'm going to tell you little stories about who they are, because what we have in Newport, which is quite remarkable, is we have an incredible repository at our libraries of primary, meaning first-person diaries, logs, written letters from these Africans themselves, talking about their life, not as a slave, but talking about their life as a father, as a mother, as an artisan, as a merchant, fighting for their country. The Africans debated at that time, we're going to fight for this new America, but we're not even free in America. Should we fight? And they did for the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. As John Clemino did, he did and died for his country as a privateer. mean, think of John Comino. If I was to offer a definition of the greatest American patriot and hero, think of a John Comino who has arrived as a slave. He wins his freedom through a lottery in Newport, but he doesn't have enough money to buy the freedom of his wife, Duchess, and his 3 daughters. So he signs on as a privateer. He decides to participate and support this revolutionary cause, knowing full well that there is no guarantee when this war ends that he and people like him will be free in this new America. No guarantee. There was no promises during the American Revolution. You fight for this new United States of America, and we will guarantee your freedom. The British offered that, and many more Africans fought for the British. But the Americans had never offered and guaranteed complete freedom to any slave that fought. So here's a John Comino saying, I'm here, I have a family, I'm free, I want my family free. I will fight for my country. I will do what I can to fight for this new country, defend this country, and ultimately he paid the greatest sacrifice. He died for this country. In my mind, John Comino is a hero. He's a patriot because he sacrificed beyond his own self. He sacrificed beyond his own social, cultural, racial circumstance because he believed someday this sacrifice will pay off. And John Comino was right, and that's why we're all here to this day. But let's talk about these Africans and who they were. This is an actual marker of John Comino's wife, Duchess Comino. Both of them came from a village in Ghana. They both arrived almost simultaneously to Newport. John Comino in a private house of the Gardner family as a slave, and Duchess Comino arrived in the house of the Channing family, specifically William Ellery Channing. William Ellery Channing is a part of the old founding families. His father was an attorney general during the colonial era, late colonial era. His grandfather, William Ellery, was one of the 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence here in Rhode Island. In fact, his grandfather, William Ellery, was a staunch fighter against slavery and slave trade, a staunch fighter against it to the time of his death. And young William Ellery Channing, who grew up in the household, the house still stands on School Street. It's the former Child and Family Services building. And young William Ellery Channing grew up and literally was raised by this Duchess Comino, who was the cook and servant in the household. William Ellery Channing, so St. Michael's students, you should look this up later. Look up who this William Ellery Channing. He later becomes a very influential reverend. In fact, he becomes the founder of the Unitarian faith. Today, we recognize the Unitarian faith as having a belief of the universal equality of all men, all women, all faiths under one God. William Ellery Channing would write and say that his belief in universal equality of all was because of being raised by this African woman. She influenced me that Africans are human beings, not chattel property. And she gave me the humanity, the love that I have to this day because of this woman. And in fact, at the time of her death, that marker was etched by William Ellery Channing personally to make sure that everyone understood at the time of her death, this was not a beast of the field, it was not a chattel property, it was not a slave, but it was a wonderful woman and human being who touched him and many people in the community. And she died with honesty and piety and industrious. Now, I got to give you one great story about Duchess Comino. When her husband had died as a privateer, she was on her own, so she had to figure out a way to win her freedom and pay for her freedom. Most Africans in Newport during the colonial era would mostly purchase their freedom. Yes, there were cases as a part of wills and masters and mistresses, they would free them, but in most cases, it was a financial transaction. So many of the Africans on Sundays for the Christian community were not required to work, but they could work on their own. So if you were an African on Sunday, you were not required to work for your master or mistress, but you could do work on your own and keep the money paid for that service. Either if you were a cord winder or a soap maker or whatever you might be doing, you could keep that money on your own. And Africans would save and save and save and use that money to purchase their freedom and incrementally the freedom of their family and loved ones. Duchess Comino was a pastry cook. And in fact, at one point in her later life, she was called the pastry queen of Rhode Island, and she was what today we call a caterer. She would actually cook in the ovens of the Channing household, and then she would literally provide catered lunching and dining for the Rhode Island State Capitol at the Colony House, because Newport's the capital at that time, private parties for merchants. And on Mary Street, she opened up her own little pastry shop or cake shop. And cakes then weren't really sweet cakes. So think of kind of, that bread and muffins that doesn't rise very well and kind of sits there on the counter. That was a main staple of food at that time. She was a pastry, and she earned a great living. She actually became quite well-to-do. And again, she was recognized as one of the most entrepreneurial young African women of her time. And she purchased and raised her children in freedom and died in freedom at Newport. This is one of her daughters, Violet. Again, the marker stands very close to Duchess in a grouping with the family. And again, look what it says. In memory of Violet, daughter of John and Duchess Comino, who died January 25th, 1792, aged 15 years, 8 months, and 21 days. Now, let me tell you what's important about how descriptive this is. If you were a slave in South Carolina, or Barbados, or Nassau, Bahamas, if you had, and at the time of your death, if you had a marker, that would have been very rare. And if you had a marker, it probably would have said, and you'll see some here later, not that you were a human being, but you were the property of. And it would have had little or no information about who you were in your life. One of the things that the Africans ensured and what they had done in Newport is, we are not chattel property. This is my daughter, this is my father, this is my grandfather who had died here, and I will make sure you know, we will keep a record of every aspect of their life. So you will see Africans in Newport at that cemetery where we record their age was 15 years, 8 months, 21 days. You won't find that in the very few enslaved African burial grounds anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere, because these Africans had control, they maintained, and they valued their humanity. Here's two sisters that died within a year, but they died as enslaved. They're servant of Henry Bull, Esquire, and they died at age 16 of years. So what would have 16-year-old girls look like? These two beautiful young girls right here. And I want you to look at these images. These are not historical ghosts of the past. These are flesh and blood human beings, beautiful children, beautiful people that looked very much like many of us to this day. You have to humanize the fact that this isn't history, this is the history of a people, and it's the history of African people. This is one of the most famous markers there. It's a Pompey Brenton. Pompey Brenton is an enslaved of the Brenton household. Jehiel Brenton, who was a governor, William Brenton. They're the earliest settlers here into Newport. Today, Brenton Point Park, Fort Adams State Park, the entire swath of Ocean Drive was controlled by the Brenton family. They were some of the wealthiest settlers in America at that time. In fact, in Barbados, nearly all of the horses that were transported to Barbados for work and for pleasure and for racing came from Rhode Island, and mostly raised to the Brenton family here in Newport and also across the way in Narragansett. In fact, it's called today the famous Narragansett Pace Horse. I was in Barbados last year seeing it in their racetrack, and all they talked about were the finest horses that were bred from Newport. And then they would ask, why did they come from Newport? We don't get that. Do you have blacks in Newport? Do you have slavery in Newport? How did that happen? And then they sat down, we had a whole story around that. But Pompey Brenton, who began as a servant in the household, as Jehiel Brenton became governor, he became his clerk and his scribe, and became quite adept and well-known, well-recognized as a clerk in the Rhode Island State Capitol building at Newport. He also later became what was called the king or the governor of the Negro community or slave community. Starting in the 1740s, there was a tradition every spring where Africans would come together in Newport. They would come together in the spring, and they would select a tribal chief. What the white community anglicized or interpreted as a governor, a Negro governor, but they were electing their tribal chief. And many of the Africans that arrived here from Ghana, many of them came from royalty. So when they arrived, everyone here knew who they were. So every spring, these Africans would elect a tribal leader, or as the whites would say, as a Negro governor. And the whites actually even called it election day, that they would elect their tribal chiefs. Pompey Brenton was one of those chiefs for a number of years. And we later find that this same custom was going on in Bridgeport, Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, Boston, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Providence, Rhode Island. But this Pompey Brenton is very important because he was kind of a big deal. And I'll give you a quick story about this. My oldest daughter's in grad school in New York, and You know, it's really tough growing up in my family. My kids are 9th generation Newporters, so every generation, you got to know every aspect of history. And every parent and grandparent will ensure you know every history aspect. I was no different from my kids. And my daughter Ashley, she was 9, and we're out at the cemetery, and we're cleaning things up, and I'm showing her the Pompey Brenton marker, and I'm telling her how Pompey Brenton is kind of a big deal guy. He's this African, and he's literally the clerk for the colonial governor. He's one of the first African tribal chiefs. He's a really big deal, and we should be really proud of him. And my daughter at the time looked up at me and said, you know, Dad, what I really like about this marker is it kind of looks like me. Now, my daughter's beautiful and doesn't look exactly like that. But what she was telling me, what I completely missed, and what is one of the most unique aspects of this African burying ground that you will not see anywhere in the few places that still survive where enslaved Africans had died and as a cemetery, several African stone cutters actually cut the stones, inscribed the stones of fellow Africans. And unlike the stones of the white community where an angel or a cherub had white features, the features are black features. So Pompey Brenton has an angel in a feature that doesn't look too much like George or Martha Washington, but it looks an awful like John Comino and Pompey Brenton. And my daughter at 9 got something and connected to something that I missed because I was talking over her head about the history. She could identify with it. That looks like me. It feels like me. I want to know more about that. That's kind of my history. I see it right there in front of me. And we have dozens of markers that have images of angels that look less like Martha and George Washington and more like Duchess and John Comino and Pompey Brenton. That's a gift the African community has given to us that we have to this day. Here's an example of a group of markers where, and again, the colonial times being a very active international trading port, as ships arrive with products, they also arrive with pestilence. And there are just cycles of yellow fever and pestilence running through the city. In fact, Coasters Island, where we stand, was actually a place where cholera and yellow fever victims were placed. Also Jamestown, out of the main community, across the harbor. So many children would die young. Many people would die young. And here's an example of an entire family. Jack Carr, his wife Villet, actually he reverts back to his African name Sango. Names like Sango, Sambo, those are all African names. Well, Sango Carr and his wife actually had 9 children. They're free. They kept having kids. They kept at it. And their family burying area has 8 of them there. And it gives you a real indication of what life was like dying young, living a short period of time. But Mr. Carr and his family made sure that every single one of his children had a marker and a recognition. And that's exactly what those children would have looked like at that time. Really cute kids from Ghana. This is my wife's favorite marker. This is an African slave girl. Now, let me read. You can read it yourself, but let me read and focus on what's being said here. This is an enslaved girl. This is not a free girl. And look what their master, Robert Oliver, says. This is Anne, a Negro child belonging to Robert Oliver, daughter to his Negro Mimbo, it's a day name, Wednesday for girls, died 2 years of age, June 1743. So Robert Oliver has done something that's remarkable as a slave master. He's given a marker. I mean, in most cases, they were just burials. But he gave a marker. But in that marker, Robert Oliver is making it very clear at that time and for us to read today, this 2-year-old child was his possession first. And by the way, let me remind you, the mother, that's my possession also. So I want to make it absolutely clear. Slavery in New England was still slavery. It was possession. There were opportunities to advance yourself as compared to what it might have been in the South and the West Indies. But this young Anne, at the time of the age of 2, died as a slave. Now let's contrast it to another slave girl, Peg. In memory of Peg, a Negro servant to Henry Bull, died July 21st, 1740, aged 6 years. What would a 6-year-old slave child have been doing in Newport at that time? If she was a young girl, she would have been a house servant. She would have been carrying water from the wells. She would have been maintaining the house, sweeping the house. Later, as she gotten older, she would have picked up a trade, probably a seamstress in a sail loft. There are many African women in sail lofts. Cord winding would have been a trade for both young African. If you know the art of cord winding or rope making, it's very arduous and it's actually it's a very challenging trade because it starts with that initial twine. So they would take children and wrap around them the twine, and then a cord winding loft or building was very, very long. I mean, it ran blocks and blocks and blocks. In Newport, there would have been one where, right behind the Quaker Meeting House where the Martin Luther King Center is, on Marcus Wheaton Boulevard. And then would have been another one very close to where the Viking Hotel is on Bellevue Avenue, because that was the outskirts of town. So what you do is you have a child, winds the cord around their waist, and they start walking and twisting. And they get to the end and add another, and they start walking and twisting. And you can see back, forth, back, forth. And then as this cord starts to take shape, they take it in a larger child, and then eventually an adult. That's why it's not called rope making, it's cord winding. And then later they would have winding machines within that. And then to keep it taut, to have the twine connect, they'd use lacquer and molasses to tie it together. They would heat it up. Very, very dangerous. Lots of fires. These were wood sheds, the cord itself, the hemp. That's why it was placed on the outsides of town. But young African children were cord winders. In fact, you'll see a marker in a second where one of those Africans becomes and operates his own rope-making business and becomes very prosperous within town. And this is him. This is Arthur Flagg. Arthur Flagg arrives as Nuba TK from Ghana at the age of 12. He's brought into the Ebenezer Flagg household. Ebenezer Flagg later becomes a colonel in the Rhode Island, I think 2nd Regiment, don't hold me on that, in the Continental Army. And the Flaggs are ardent, active rope makers. This Nuba TK is apprenticed, and he becomes an artisan in rope making. The Flagg family are worshiping in the Seventh-day Baptist Church, a Sabbatarian Baptist church. As the Baptist faith was formed in Rhode Island by Roger Williams, the first Baptist church, the actual first Baptist church structure, is actually established in Middletown in an area called Green's End, or Green End Avenue and Valley Road. That's where John Clark, who had established it, had his farm. Later, he would build a second mid-17th century in-town church, which is located today at Spring Street next to Turrell Synagogue, the United Baptist Church, because that was a town spring. You built your institutional buildings around the town spring. Well, within 2 years of establishing the Baptist Church, a group of Baptists got together and said, we got it all wrong. The day of worship is not Sunday, it's Saturday, so we will establish the Sabbatarian or the Seventh-day Baptist Church. They broke off. And in fact, their chapel, which still exists, it would have been on the corner of Spring and Barney Street. That's today the visitor center for Turrell Synagogue. The actual chapel is right up the street behind the Historical Society building. This Nuba TK, enslaved as Arthur Flagg, becomes a member of the Seventh-day Baptist Church. He owns his own pew, becomes one of the longest contributing members of that church. And most importantly, at the time of his death, his marker, which is a very tall, prominent marker, is inscribed and supported by the church. And again, he's a man who changed the world for the better. He's not a slave, not a chattel property. He's an African man who changed the world for the better. And in fact, once he became free, he kept his Christian faith, maintained it, and he went back and called himself Arthur TK. And you see lots of writings about him that go back and forth between. In fact, scholars later on would think they were different people, but you find him just simply blending his African heritage with his new Christian religion and his American heritage as a new American. And here's his son, who dies at a young age, Solomon Nuba TK. Solomon, his Christian name, Nuba TK, his African name. He dies at the age of 5 years and 2 months in 1785. And we actually even have his granddaughters buried with him in the family. This is his granddaughters, Phoebe, Amber, and Betsy, all died together within a very short period of time and buried together in multiple markers, but all within a family complex. But again, all a part of a loving family. There's no slaves here. These are human beings who have contributed greatly to their community, to their society, and to their country. And I want to provide these last two slides as kind of a very interesting anomaly. So maybe these St. Michaels, I've been talking a lot to the students here because they're the future. Maybe some of you are going to be scholars in the near future and can help us with this. One of the real anomalies of this burying ground that we're trying to figure out, we don't have historical evidence to explain why this is. It just exists. We have dozens and dozens of African children, and particularly women, with the name Violet. We've gone through all the records of colonial Newport at that time. We cannot find any white women with the name Violet. It's exclusively with African women. Now, the African violet is discovered at that time. It's a beautiful flower, beautiful young ladies and children, but we have no historical evidence or reference to understand why violet was so popular and so well used in simply the African community, but it was. And as you can see here, this is just a list of a number of the violets that lived, worked, worshiped, played, and eventually died in early Newport. And let me end here with, I think, the most important statement is that the truly dead are those who have been forgotten. It is our obligation today and going forward to tell the stories of these early Africans, but not from the perspective of simply how they got here, as my grandmother said, but from the perspective of how they lived, how they contributed. And what we have here in this community of Newport, which no one else has, is that we've got not only their stories and their physical place, but we have an opportunity to tell it in a context of celebration. There is no shame to be of African descent in this community, in this country, in this world. There is no shame to have ancestors that arrived here under the horrific circumstance of slavery, because these African children, if it wasn't for their arrival, their work, their life, their culture, everything that we take for granted today in America would not exist. Hip-hop music is West African tribal music. Our burial ceremonies, you ever go to New Orleans when someone dies and everyone lines up in parades and marches to the funeral? That's a West African tribal custom. They were doing that in Newport in the 18th century. It would drive the Quakers crazy. They couldn't understand it. An African child would die. They would meet in Washington Square, the parade grounds. They would grab drums, bangs, pots, and they would march out with the body to the burying ground, have a whole burying system, and then they would come back and have a whole feast. And the Quakers would say, "But it's a child. What are you doing? Why aren't you mourning? Where's the wake?" And the Africans would respond in saying, "You don't get it. They have now rejoined our ancestors. They have now, under God, rejoined our ancestors. Yes, we're sad we lost the physical presence, but we're celebrating that they rejoined the long line of our ancestors. We celebrate that." So it's important for you in closing that you recognize this is not a story about slavery. It's not a story about historical ghosts of the past. It's a story about flesh and blood human beings that once lived, worked, played, worshiped, fought, cried, happy, sad. All the things that we do today, they did at that time. And we need to recognize it, we need to celebrate it, and most importantly, we need to carry that story forward. So thank you for being very patient. I don't know how much time we have, but I'll certainly try to answer any questions about this. But if you want to learn more, students, we've got a great website. It's colonialcemetery.com. Simple, colonialcemetery.com. You can go on, you can hit a marker, and that'll pop up the marker, and you'll have a story behind it. And it's got some great links to some of the other historical stories about these early Africans in Newport, and then later in Rhode Island and across the country. But again, if there's a few more minutes, I'll try to answer any quick questions you might have. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Thank you. Great. Any quick questions, please? The students, yes?
In Gone with the Wind, the slaves in the South there, I'm not saying that they were happy that they were slaves, but they seemed like pretty upbeat, and like especially like Mammy, she was like, "Oh, Miss Scarlet, something something." But how come they were depicted as happy in that movie?
Because very few Africans produced, wrote, and distributed Gone with the Wind. That's the easy answer. To be fair with that is that you shouldn't use Hollywood at any time to be a reference point for historical information. You go to the library, you do the research, you visit the cemetery, you take a historical tour. And Gone with the Wind, for the time it was produced and the value that it provided, has historical value. I enjoyed the movie. I enjoyed it greatly. But at no point did I ever have any expectation when I saw it the first time at 10 or 12, or the last time a couple of years ago, that I have any expectation that Gone with the Wind was going to tell the story about people of color, and certainly African Americans in slavery. So I enjoy the movies. It's great drama, but it's not accurate, and you shouldn't have that expectation to that. What you've heard today, and again, the history at the Redwood Library, Newport Historical Society, John Connor Brown Library in Providence, that's where you want to learn the real history of what it was like to be a servant woman in the 19th century in Georgia. In fact, if you've got time, as you walk around Newport, we're going to go to the cemetery, right? You're going to go get to see the cemetery. If you've got time, go to Turrell Synagogue. It's the oldest existing synagogue in North America. A few of us built a visitor center there on Spring Street, right where that Seventh-day Baptist Church would be. And on the second floor, we have these really interesting and neat kind of CGI movies where you can kind of push a button, and we actually have actors and actresses reenacting a history of the synagogue. It was African slaves that built the synagogue. They built all the buildings in Newport at that time, and there's actually two women, I won't even tell you anymore, but two African women who are going to talk about what was it like in 1763 when they completed the synagogue and what they were doing in town at that time. Go see that, and then go back and look at Mammy and the Gone of the Wind, and I think you figure out what's more interesting and accurate. But that was a great question. Thank you. It was a great one. Anything else, please? Yes?
I just wanted to comment, Keith, on the way you've taken tombstones that I think most people think of as just something that's old and crusty and turned them into living, breathing people. Itself would make a fantastic movie about Newport's history. It's just taking a tombstone and bringing back the person that was there.
I think that's a great point. I will tell you, and I wrestle with this being, I've been a long-time advisor on the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and we've had a lot of discussions about how to properly care and maintain cemeteries. I get very concerned about any potential commercialization of what is really a sacred place. The common burial ground and that Godzo Lake portion that's there is a public active cemetery. My dad, was a World War II veteran, is there. My uncle was a Tuskegee flyer and killed in World War II, is there. And I have to be very sensitive to the fact that it's a place to be respected. It's a place of burial then and today and in the future. And I have to be very careful of doing anything that might commercialize that. So we're having some interesting dialogues working with research organizations, historical organizations. We have a sign there that we've just taken down to repair that are going to encourage people to come to the cemetery and enjoy it. But if the sign, when we bring it back, you'll see things where we say, don't rub the stones, pick up after your dogs, please be careful there, because you always try to find balance between historical attractions that are in their unique, fragile form and Disney World. There's a whole span between the two. And one of the things that's so important about Newport, I get to say this as a Newporter, if you've been to Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, or Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts, or Plymouth Plantation, Massachusetts, they are wonderful recreations. They are just remarkable recreations. There is nothing authentic there. But in Newport, the burying ground, the homes, the places of worship, the wharfs, they're as they were. I mean, people still worship in a lot of our colonial places of worship as active congregations. People can still walk through the cemetery and see the marker of Duchess Comino or Saba Nubia, or whoever you might see. People can go through these homes and actually see what it was like to be in a pantry or a garret. So what's important about that construct is that we try to maintain things as living, breathing, active historical assets, but we try to maintain them on a very personal human scale level, and we try to stay away from anything that potentially can commercialize it or bring it to a level where we get overwhelmed. We don't want tour buses queuing up on Farewell Street to have tour guides running up and down the cemetery. That's not good for the cemetery. It's not good for the families of past, present, and future. So it's an important aspect because we talk about this all the time. How do we get this story out? And that's why we like social media, websites, interactive, because you may not have to be there, but you can get all the information without having to be there, and there's a lot of wear and tear in these markers. As I began, there were probably over 4,000 markers in the African burial ground alone during the course of the history. Most were lost. My mom, who's 89, she would tell me stories about walking through that section. You could barely walk through it because there were markers everywhere. That was in the 40s. Today, there's lots of gaps, there's lots of spaces. In fact, Jim Garman, professor at South Virginia University, he and his grad students have been recovering markers for years for us. And it's using sounding machines. Sometimes they topple over, and then they just recede into the earth. In other cases, they break, and then people toss pieces away. In other cases, unfortunately, people have taken slate markers out of there and used it for patios. So it's very important for us to be able to maintain the historic place in its natural state and be very cautious about anything that might commercialize that. So it's a challenge. It really is, and we talk about it each and every day. And I struggle with it quite candidly, because the final point with that is that many of the slate markers, slate's a very porous material, and what happens is it just flakes away. And there's been lots of discussions about how we might restore these markers. In some cases, they're re-encased. In other cases, they're actually taken out and then put away, and then replicas are put in. There's lots of discussions around that. I'm from the school of, when the time comes for God to take it back in the earth, let it go back. But let's not put artificial concrete materials around it. Let's keep it as it is. It's a cemetery for people to interact with. But through information technology and digital media technology, we can come in and take records of this, digitize it, and keep it for prosperity. So that's my personal. There are others who don't believe. They say come in, put fences around it, protect it, replace it, and then it becomes more colonial Williamsburg and less common burial ground of Newport, which I think many of us are trying to ascribe to do. So thank you for that.
Keith, brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. A little more personal, how did your ancestors arrive in Newport, and what circumstances?
How did my ancestors arrive in Newport? Several sets. My maternal grandmother is Jewish and a part of Turrell Synagogue. So that whole wing came in the mid-18th century. And it's interesting to me because my maternal grandmother, she married my grandfather, who was from West Indies, and then left the Jewish faith, and we became members of Trinity Anglican Church in 1903. But we maintained a lot of our Jewish collections and such. So I own Judaica going back to the 17th and 18th century, and it's been a lot of fun for me. On my grandfather's side from the West Indies, they were arriving here in the latter part of the 18th century, and then back between Bridgeport, Connecticut, Barbados, Jamaica, to Newport, moving and such. So those two lines are very tied to Newport. So I've been fortunate where, within my family, they've kept pretty much everything. So I've got, you name it, every artifact that you would think, furniture, library, books, and such, that were just passed on because, and I want to say this, unfortunately, America has not fully embraced the history of what I call the rest of us. If you weren't a part of the first families of Virginia, if you were not a part of the Mayflower, if you were not a part of the first original founding European families, your history was less relevant. It's what the young man said about Gone with the Wind. I mean, Gone with the Wind is not an historical, accurate depiction of African Americans in plantation life of the South. Just like there's many historical depictions that are not accurate representations of Irish, and of Jews, and of Italians, and of Portuguese. So one of the things that's been very important in our household is not to depend upon society to teach the history of my people to me. I should not expect to go into a school or a library and have that taught to me. That should be a responsibility of my family. That is an West African trait and custom. You pass on information down the family line. You are connected by your ancestors in the past, and you have a responsibility to carry forward their lives, their history, the word forward. So I was able to grow up in an environment where before I ever saw Gone with the Wind, I had already had it figured out, and when I saw it, I kind of laughed through the movie quite candidly. Because I already was empowered by my grandparents, my parents, my aunts and uncles, a number of wonderful people in this community who had already made sure that I got it, and that I was reading, and I was touching, and I was feeling the history of people who looked like me, or maybe worshiped like me. And what that provides is, it provides a sense of humanity, and it gives you a better perspective that we are truly equal. Go back to what William Ellery Channing said. He became the leader and founder of the Universal Church movement because he was touched by this African woman. He got to live side by side, to be nurtured and supported by this African woman. When he became a young man and later in the clergy, he didn't have a sense of the fact that these Africans are inhumans. What are you talking about? I lived with them. They're part of my life, part of my family. They should deserve and have the same rights as any one of us in this great country. So it's about education, it's about training, but most importantly, and I make this plea to particularly people of color in the audience, it's our responsibility to share this history to our children, our friends, and our neighbors. Because I'll give you one very devastating demographic. Kids of color in this country today, particularly of African descent and Latinos, in many, it's a blurred line, are not succeeding. They don't have a sense that they can achieve. They're failing in schools, they're failing in commerce, they're not achieving, and it goes back to a very basic premise. They don't have a sense of an identity that they belong. that this is their country, that they have every opportunity to succeed because they have as much opportunity because people that look like them built this country for them and for them to prosper. I can't tell you, when I go to the South and do lectures, and it's always fascinating to me that kids of color down there, when I present this history and story, they look at me and said, nobody's ever told me this. I had no idea. I want to learn more. I want to know more about this. You see a light bulb go off. You see a light flicker on. Because all of a sudden, they have a sense that history gives me entitlement. The history of this country and how I fit in that history gives me an ability to understand that I can achieve too. There were people that looked just like me that were doing things in the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. Why can't I do it today in the 21st century? I grew up in a household where my uncle was a Tuskegee flyer. He graduated from Rogers High School here in Newport. He was 20 years old. I still have his letters sending to my Nana, my grandmother, when he got down to Alabama and did all the wrong things as a northern colored boy. He went to the wrong soda shops. He got on the train. They get to the Mason-Dixon line, and all of a sudden he's told to go to the back, and he says, why do I go to the back? He did all the wrong things because he didn't know. And when he got there, the Southern boys made sure he knew. And there he was. He got his wings. He went out in his last training mission. They tipped wings. He flipped over and he died. He was 20 years old when he died serving his country. So I don't need to watch Gone with the Wind to know what it's like to be a proud person of color. I had that in my family. I had that in the community. So turn off the TVs, open the books, and just talk to people in your community. Reach out to people who may not necessarily look like you or think like you, and I will guarantee you, you'll have a much more rewarding and a much more fulfilled life. Maybe one more question. Yes, always the students, they get the last. How long have I been studying slavery in Newport? All my life. You're born into it. And it's not a study, it's a passion. It's my life. I'll give you a hint. The reason why I really enjoy this is because it's about me. It's something that I owned. It's something that I can identify with and something I'm very proud of. And I'll give you my last story, because stories are important for young people. I'll give you my last great story. When I was in 3rd grade and then in 4th grade here in Newport, Sheffield School, which is closed now, but was my favorite school. And in 3rd grade, and I bet all of you had to do this, in 3rd grade, we always had a Thanksgiving Day play. And that Thanksgiving Day play in 3rd grade and later 4th grade, maybe I'm kind of old and you guys don't do this now, you're more politically correct. But in 3rd grade, I had my Thanksgiving Day play, and it was to be a reenactment of the Pilgrims in Thanksgiving. And I was the only black kid in the class at that time, which was never an issue, never a problem. But I was the only black kid. And in 3rd grade, we were laying out the roles of who was going to be John Alden, who was going to be this and that. I was the Indian. I was selected to be the Indian. The next year, 4th grade, we had the play again, and we were laying out the roles. John Alden, who's a pilgrim, I was to be the Indian. So I told my dad, and my dad kind of said, that's interesting, 2 years in a row and you're the Indian. So before the play, the week before, we went to New York to see my uncle, Jules Haywood, who has died. He was the chairman of the New York State Indian Council. Very prideful man, my uncle. And he was the head of the entire New York State Indian Council, and that was the Iroquois and the Oneida Indians. So we were at my uncle's house, and I told him, I'm going to be the Indian, in my play at school. And my dad said, yes, 2nd year in a row, he's going to be the Indian. So my uncle said, well, you know what? Here's what we're going to do. He went and brought and gave to me his full turkey headdress. He gave me his, not tomahawks, coup sticks. He gave me his breastplate. And when I came back to Sheffield School to be the Indian, I was the coolest kid in the class. Every white kid in that class wanted to be the Indian. Nobody wanted to be John Alden. And I tell you this story because my parents could have been angry. They could have been frustrated. They could have passed that anger and frustration on to me. We could have picked up the phone and called the principal. What's going on here? 2 years in a row, the Indian. But no. They decided, you know what? The Indian is cool. And we have some of that heritage. And let's share that. And you, Keith, you go back and share it to the kids in the school. That's how you deal with this. We're all a part of a single world community. And we need to share our history, our culture, our language. And once you start sharing those things, we can all be the Indian chief. All the issues of competition, and warfare goes away. Let's all be that Indian chief and share our culture and heritage and identity together. So thank you very much. I greatly enjoyed this.
Thank you so much for that inspiring and fascinating talk. And this is a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
Please join me once again in thanking Keith for that fantastic presentation.
I wanted to be. I really wanted to be.
It was phenomenal.